Well, good evening, everybody. Wonderful to have y'all in class. Sorry to shut down the good conversation that's happening, but we got to get going. We're going to be beginning in Genesis chapter 4 tonight, and I'm going to ask an awkward question to start. Who did their reading this week? Very good. That's better than I thought. That's awesome. I realized this afternoon that I made a mistake, and I say that ask people to do the reading at the very end of class, which means that half the class is gone by the time I mention the reading. So, for the record, if you want to know if you are a parent of a young child, the reading for next week is going to be Genesis 6 through 9. So we're going to be talking about the story of Noah and the flood and the ark and all that good stuff. So if you want to read that and get ahead of the game, then you can do that. This evening we're going to talk about Genesis 4 through 5. We're going to talk about the story of Cain and Abel. We're going to talk about the genealogy of Cain and the genealogy of Seth. And I think when we dig into it, you'll start to see, at least with this genealogy, there are a lot of deeper tones that are there, a lot of very important things that are happening when Moses gets going into this genealogy. So we'll bring a little bit of that out. But before we begin, I'm going to ask Ming Wei if he'll lead us in an opening prayer. Amen. So you've probably heard the phrase before. There are two kinds of people in the world, right? You've heard that before. And we use that phrase a lot. At least I use that phrase a lot. And we use it to talk about a number of different things. And so I'm going to use a couple of those phrases tonight. Two kinds of people in the world. I want to know which one you are. So there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those who let people merge on the highway and those who don't. Which one are you? You know who you are. There are those who order $7 drinks at Starbucks. Oh, come on. Yes, okay. Yes, $6 drinks at Starbucks. Who do I got there? Okay. Ethan, really? All right. All right. And then there are those who have money, right? That's the rest of us. There are those who carry paper Bibles and those who use electronic Bibles. Who's got an electronic Bible tonight and exclusively uses electronic Bible? Very good. See, it looks like a regular paper Bible when you do that, but it's not, right? There are those who like red sauce on pizza and those who are insane and like white sauce on pizza. Who's a white sauce person? One. A couple, but definitely white sauce. Okay, you and Leah are on the same page there. So that's an interesting way to kind of divide things up. You know, you're on this side or you're on that side. You can't sit on the fence. You have to choose one of the two sides. It's an interesting way to, kind of figure stuff out about people and see what people are like, what their personality is. And we're very comfortable doing that, right? You either, if you're from Kentucky, you like Louisville, or you like the Superior University, the University of Kentucky, right? Sorry about that. So that's interesting, right? And so we don't really mind that. We joke around about that, except when it comes to spiritual things, right? It's then when we get to that, either or, there's no sitting on the fence, there's no middle ground, it's this or it's that kind of language that people start to get uncomfortable, and people don't like that, right? So the question on the board tonight is, how would most people respond to me saying there are only two possible eternal destinations? And maybe we could go further and say it's either heaven or it's hell. How would people in our world respond? Obviously, people in a church are different. Somebody walking on the street, you say, look, you're either going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell based on how you live your life. How do they respond to that? How do people feel about that? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so you're narrow-minded, you're ignorant, you're a creationist. All right? Some of those are true. What else? What would most... Yes, sir. Okay, so I'm not going to play that game, right? I'm going to sit on the sidelines. I'm not going to choose a side. I'm just going to pretend like that's not the case. Okay? Yes, sir. Right? And so maybe they're even more narrow than we are, right? It's all heaven for everybody because a loving God would never send anybody to hell, okay? Certainly some people will respond that way. Or there is no heaven or hell, right? None of those things really do exist. Is there another option there? Another option that's kind of been invented? Pretty popular one. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so maybe that's what they say, right? It doesn't matter what else I do. I'm wearing my cross, so I'm going to heaven. What about the idea of purgatory, though? Right? Did I get you there, Debbie? Yeah. So that's interesting, right? So reincarnation is another humanistic idea that we've made up, that we pretend is spiritual, but isn't really, right? So you're not going to go to heaven or hell when you die. Instead, you're going to be reborn, and maybe you'll be reborn as something kind of good if you're good, or something kind of bad if you're bad. And then we have the Catholics who've invented the notion of purgatory, right? And so when it comes to your eternal destination, really good people go to heaven, really, really, really bad people go to hell, and pretty much everybody else goes to purgatory to suffer for a time before they go to heaven, right? So people really don't like that either-or kind of language, that you're either on this side or you're on that side. But I want you to see early on in the book of Genesis, God sets the tone for this. The Holy Spirit sets the tone for this. He makes it very clear that there are two eternal destinations, and though that is based on the fact that there are really only two ways to live your life. And so that's what I want to talk with you about tonight. How in Genesis we learn that there really are, at the end of the day, only two ways to live your life. So Genesis 4 begins with the story of Cain, and his story sets the tone for chapters 4 and 5. And really, it's going to show us that there are two ways to live your life and two possible destinations where you might end up. So, Genesis 4, verse 1. The man was intimate with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. She said, I have had a male child with the Lord's help. She also gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel became a shepherd of flocks, but Cain worked the ground. In the course of time, Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but he did not have regard for Cain and his offering. Cain was furious, and he looked despondent. So, by the way, if you're wondering why I use the CSB, it is so I don't have to read phrases like, and his countenance fell, right? He looked despondent. I understand that a little bit better. So let me ask you, when you read through those verses, what sticks out to you about the story of Cain and Abel? What sticks out to you there? What do you find important about those verses? Yes, ma'am.
God definitely made some distinctions between what was acceptable and what was not.
Yeah, okay. So that's pretty clear. There are some things that are acceptable to God and some things that aren't acceptable to God. And that's interesting, right? That blows that humanistic idea out of the water, right? That good intentions are good enough, right? I'm just going to have good intentions and try to, do good. It doesn't really matter if I get it right as long as I'm trying, right? That kind of blows that out of the water because God obviously accepts some and doesn't accept others. I think it's interesting to back up a little bit more that really the first human activity that we read about after we get out of Eden is what? It's sacrifice, it's worship. I just find that an intriguing idea, how it shows us how this idea that we are going to sacrifice things to God, we are going to worship God, it is such a fundamental thing. I think sometimes Christians miss that. I almost said New Testament Christians, but that doesn't make any sense. Sometimes Christians miss that, right? We come here, we offer our worship on Sunday, and then we kind of leave worship out of our lives, except for when we come to services. But worship and sacrifice, that's something that's fundamental from the very beginning of the story. And, as Miss Kathy said, it's important to notice that someone does it wrong. Which we're sitting here in this time, and we have people saying, look, as long as I try to worship God, it doesn't matter how I worship God, He's just going to be pleased with whatever I offer. From the beginning of the Bible, that's not true, right? God makes it clear. He worshipped right, He worshipped wrong. I'm going to accept Him, and I'm not going to accept Him. So let me ask you the age-old question. Why is Cain rejected when Abel is accepted? What do you think? Yes, ma'am? Okay. Okay. That's right. And ultimately, that's the perfect answer. We don't really know exactly what was wrong, but we do know the reason why Cain messed up. He did not act in faith, and he probably did not offer a sacrifice the right way as God had commanded because he didn't have the faith that he needed. So that absolutely is the right answer. That Hebrews 11:5, it separates Abel by his faith. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Why is Cain accepted and Abel accepted and Cain rejected? Yes, sir. Yeah, and so maybe it's showing us the loss of life that's required to cover our sins and things like that. Maybe it's a calling forward to the New Testament. What else? Yes, ma'am.
I think that it's interesting that one of the things that is said is that Abel brought first place of his flock. It doesn't mention anything about Cain. It just says that Cain brought an offering to the ground. It doesn't say from the first place. While there's not, whether it is not blood involved, it also doesn't mention
Yeah, and those really, at least in my experience, those are two schools of thought, right? One is you have to offer an animal, right? You have to sacrifice by blood. And the other is that Abel offered his first fruits, the firstlings of his flock, and Cain, it does not say that he offered the first of his produce of the ground. And whichever one of those may be true, there's important spiritual implications to that too, right? We understand that Jesus has to die. It's not good enough for us to, according to Micah 6, give him rivers and rivers and rivers of oil, right? We need the sacrifice of Jesus to cover our sins. But we also understand that what we offer to God should be our first fruits, right? We should give him the best of the best that we can offer to God. And so that's an interesting conversation to have, but ultimately, what I want you guys to see is that there is this dividing line that becomes very clear at the very beginning of this story. That you are either accepted by God or you're rejected by God. There's no middle ground. There's no halfway point. There's no, 0 to 100% kind of thing. It is either yes or no, pass, fail. You're either accepted by God or rejected by God. And while that would make some people uncomfortable, it certainly is the truth of our universe. Do any New Testament passages come to mind when you think of this idea of pass, fail, accepted, or rejected? Yeah. That old passage comes to mind, right? Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way which leads to destruction. There are two ways to live life. You enter through the narrow gate that leads to life, or you enter through the broad path that leads to death. That's just the way it works. So, moving on, I want you to see what happens next. Look with me in Genesis 4, 6 through 7. After Cain's countenance fell, it says, Then the Lord said to Cain, Why are you furious? Why do you look despondent? If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. And so those two verses introduce a whole slew of important ideas and important conversations. So when Cain sees that he's not been accepted by God, there's a little thumbtack here that keeps getting in my way, I'm sorry. When Cain sees that he is not being accepted by God, he's angry. But his story doesn't end there, because God responds to Cain's anger by asking him 3 questions. He says, Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? And maybe more important than all of those is the third question, which is what? If you do right, then won't you be accepted? What does that imply, Guthrie? Yes, and obedience is possible, right? That at the end of the day, Cain may be mad about what God has chosen, but whose fault is that? It's Cain's fault, right? This is his responsibility, his personal responsibility. He has the choice to do what is right. He has the choice to act in faith. And he's mad, not because of what God has done. He's mad because of what he has done himself. And so often, we need to recognize that that is the case. We may look at our lives and be upset about what we're experiencing. And we may look at God and we may try to cast that blame on him. But ultimately, usually, whose fault is it? It's my fault. That's exactly right. And so the message to Cain there is the same message to us many times. If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? So God is telling Cain, and he's teaching us and the Israelites about personal responsibility. That we can do something about our lives. We can change the way we live our lives. We can choose to do what is right. And then the Lord goes even further. In verse 7, he talks a little bit about sin. He says, "But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." So what does that teach us about sin? Yes, sir.
I like the part that it talks about master. Like we're masters.
Okay, so when it comes... Go ahead.
We control how we respond to everything regarding sin. We are the master of our own.
Yeah, and so then again you have that idea of personal responsibility emphasized. You have the choice, right, to master sin. You can do that. What else? Yes, sir.
Our society states the other way that the devil may be good.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. The devil's certainly there, right? But at the end of the day, you have a choice about what you're going to do with this temptation. What else? What do you see there? Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's ultimately what we see in the story of Cain, right? I mean, you should have given a spoiler alert before you said that, because some people are sitting here wondering what's going to happen, and you just ruined it, right? Yes, sir.
The wording here, desires for rule over, it's the same as the purpose of the situation that women are placed into after the sin, where he says the desires have to be corrupted.
Yeah.
So there's this element of there's almost going to be this expected ongoing relationship, and there's going to be this struggle, and there's going to be some nagging there. So control it with making a lot of distraction.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that out. That's one of the things that I put in my notes. I put 3 things: that sin is dangerous, duh, and then I put sin isn't going anywhere, right? He says it's right at the doorstep. And so just like, I'm glad you brought that, I didn't even think about the fact that he says the same thing to Eve, right? But that's true. Just like he says to Eve, you and your seed, the people like you are going to constantly struggle with this. He's saying the same thing to them. Sin isn't going anywhere, right? This is not make a choice one time in your life whether you're going to sin or not. This is sin is a constant, ever-present reality. Sin is where? It's at the door. It's not down the street. It's crouching at your door, right outside your house every single day. And so in a sense, God is telling Cain, look, you need to get used to this. You need to get used to this feeling of temptation. And then he says, of course, you need to make the right choice concerning this, which is you need to choose to be the master of this. And that brings out another important idea, that sin can either dominate you or you can dominate it. And there really is no middle ground with that either. I think we've all experienced that in our own lives. That, look, you can be the kind of person who says, I'm going to kind of go halfway. I'm not going to do all this crazy stuff over here, but I'm going to let a little bit of sin in. And I'm going to try to, play both sides of the fence where I don't get really, really wicked, but I don't get rid of all of it. That never works, does it? Because the more sin is in our lives, the more we're slaves of sin. That's what Jesus is talking about in John chapter 8. When he talks to those Jews, whoever commits a sin is a slave of sin. Not only a slave to its consequences, but a slave to those passions and those desires which grow and grow and grow. He talks about that more if you want to write down 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 20, how people become ensnared, they become entrapped by their impulses and their desires. And the more we give into it, the more power it has over us. I would stop and read those verses, but please mark them down and read them for yourselves, because we've got to move on. But that's the idea, that you can choose to be a master over your sin and completely dominate it by getting rid of every trace of it, or you can choose to let sin be a master over you and completely dominate you. I do want to ask really quick before we move on, in your own life, in your experience, what have you found? How do you master sin? How do you get control of it and really dominate it, as opposed to the other way around? Yes, sir.
I think one of the most powerful things God has given us in the scriptures are the
belong to one another. Yet we are all for one another. And I think that when we have, especially at least with one brother, a close brother in our lives, that we're transparent with, totally, not just pieces, but totally, and say to that person, I know you care about me. Ask me anything, regardless of what it is, whether it's lust, whether it's anything else, you're not doing this or that, then we'll talk about it. We'll help each other.
Yep.
And I think that is an ongoing critical aspect of my life. Not that I've always adhered to my mission, but I know that has had a powerful impact on me.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's intense. Sometimes we're talking football, okay? We are talking football, but we're talking serious stuff.
That's right.
And then I'll be able to say what I have or have not done and what I haven't presented to.
Yeah. So accountability is a really important thing, right? Confess your sins one to another, be transparent with one another, which is interesting because I guess Cain could have had an accountability partner in Abel, but he did what we often did and he killed him instead of using him for transparency. Yes, sir.
Another important thing I think is to know our weaknesses.
Yeah.
Know things to stay away from that we think are upset. So, I think it's interesting that everyone has different touch points. Something bothers one person won't bother another.
That's exactly right. You're going to say something.
I think Psalms 1, the progressive nature that describes their walk through the advice of the wicked and stand in the path of the straight and sit progressively, listening to their advice and standing and sitting, as opposed to delighting in the Lord's instructions, meditating on it day and night, and then planning. So we put ourselves in the Word. The opposite of what it's become.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was doing a men's day in Louisville a week ago, and I asked the question in my Bible class, why do people sell their souls? And I had all kinds of really good answers for it, right? We're procrastinating, we want to buy our souls back, we think we can, play both sides of the fence. And one guy said, we don't want to sell our souls, we want to serve God, but we don't think we have to put any work into making ourselves the kind of people who serve God. So we don't read our Bible, and we don't pray, and we don't work, we don't exercise our spiritual muscles, and we think we're going to get by just on willpower. And I was like, that was not in my notes, and it should have been. But that's exactly right. The idea that, look, you can progressively get worse by giving into sin, or you can progressively get better and stronger by giving into those spiritual exercises. Those things do make us stronger. Yes, sir.
Yeah, avoidance on its own, that mention of willpower, sooner or later, you're going to lose energy, you're going to lose
Yep.
willpower goes away. But if you are constantly dedicated to positive actions, there's no room, or there's less room for those negative things to take hold. You're also going to see the truth be revealed to you as you follow the directions that God gives us.
Yeah.
Then you start to see evidence of His truth, and it helps you believe in the truth of the evil things.
Yeah, absolutely. We're transformed by truth. We're transformed by the Word. There's a lot of power in that. Yes, sir.
As in 1 Corinthians 10:13, where God says He'll allow you to be tempted beyond, but He'll provide a way of escape. We don't always look for that way of escape.
Yeah.
We look for a way to run to sin, not away from it. So it depends on what desire you have.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that out because there is an idea fundamentally at its core. This comes down to you have to decide who you're chasing, right? Am I chasing myself and my desires, or am I really turning toward God and calling out to Him? That's getting a little ahead of ourselves in Genesis because we're going to get there, but I really like that you brought that out. We need to move on. I'm sorry. Write me a text or something, or send me an email with your other comments. And so, obviously, we know that Cain makes his choice about who he's going to be. He decides that he's going to let sin be a master over him. And so this is what happens in verse 8. Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied, am I my brother's guardian? Then he said, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, so now you are cursed, alienated from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood that you have shed. If you work the ground, it will never again give you its yield. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. But Cain answered the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. since you are banishing me today from the face of the earth, and I must hide from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth, whoever finds me will kill me." Then the Lord replied to him, "In that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." And he placed a mark on Cain, so that whoever found him would not kill him. And so I want to point out to you at the very beginning, my New American Standard Bible usually says right there, "So Cain told his brother." And I never really understood that. And I think the CSB may go a little bit further than what the actual words are, but I think it captures the right idea because it actually makes sense, right? Cain brings his brother out into the field to talk to him so that he can kill him. And so it gives us the sense that this act of murder was not, as I thought in children's Bible class, just an act of passionate rage in a moment. It seems like it was what? Wow, okay. Too much Law and Order, guys. So it's premeditated, right? This is first-degree murder. So it just shows you the depths to where Cain has gone, and it shows you often what happens and what he continues to do. Instead of taking responsibility, he continues blaming other people, and he takes his rage out on other people who are innocent. That's something important to watch out for in ourselves. And I think it's also interesting to point out what Cain's punishment is. Notice that when Adam sins, God curses what? He curses the ground, and what's the curse? It's no longer going to be easy anymore. Now you're going to get bread by toil and labor and sweat. There's going to be thorns and thistles. I want you to notice that the punishment on Cain is different. What's different about Cain's punishment? So the curse is not on the ground, the curse is on who? Yeah, so God curses the ground with Adam, but he curses Cain from the ground when it comes to his sin. And so the idea there is not that the ground becomes harder to work for everybody, but the idea is what? That Cain will never have a green thumb. No matter what he does, no matter how he tries to work the ground, it is never going to yield produce for him. What's that mean? How so? Oh, yeah, because he was a farmer, right? So he was a farmer. He's like, you can't do that anymore. Thanks. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But what does that mean for his life? What happens? Because if you can't plant a garden or plant a field and grow your food, what do you have to do? You have to be dependent on others. You have to go from place to place to place to place. And so he says, you're going to be a restless wanderer. Isn't it unique? Isn't it important to notice that when Cain becomes the representative of evil and ungodliness and those who are mastered by sin, he becomes perpetually someone who does what? Wanders. Isn't that what the lost are? They are those who are tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. There's a reason why Jesus says he came to seek and save that which was lost. And so Cain becomes an archetype. He becomes an icon of worldliness and a representative of what life is like for people who've turned against God and rebelled against him. So I do think it's important, though, that even after all of this, God is not done with Cain, is he? Right? Cain can still choose to live his godly life. Despite all the consequences he has to endure, God still shows him grace. Cain says, look, I have to go away from you, and if somebody finds me, they're going to kill me. And God doesn't say, well, good, they should. That's what you get. He says, what? I'll put a mark on you, and you'll be avenged sevenfold. And so that whoever found him would not kill him. And so there you see a little bit of God's grace. And there you see that even though Cain has been really wicked and sinful and ungodly, at the end of the day, he can still choose to be one of those saved people. He can still choose to make the right choice and be somebody who chooses God. And so that shows us that there is this even more fundamental dividing line between all people, that there are two ways to live your life. And it is not, you can either worship the right way or not worship the right way, or you can either get mad and kill your brother or not get mad and kill your brother. The two fundamental ways to live your life is you can choose to seek God, or you can choose to turn away from him. From the beginning of the Bible, those are your two choices. No matter what your past looks like, that's your choice. Are you going to seek God, or are you going to turn away from him? Let me ask you, what do those two things mean? When you hear the term seeking God, what does that mean to you? Effort, okay. So I'm not just going to be laissez-faire about my spiritual life. Yeah. What else? What does it mean to seek God? Obedience, right? When He says something, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to seek Him by listening to what the words of the Bible say. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yeah, yeah. So we're looking for that reward. We're diligently seeking Him. We're putting in the effort day after day after day. Absolutely. Yeah. Seeking His favor, seeking His grace. Absolutely. So that implies sacrifice, right? And also pick up your cross daily in another translation, right? And so, or another account. And so we do, that's again, that idea of continually doing this is not just a one-time thing. Let's ask the other side of that question, though. What's it mean to turn away from God? Does that mean you become an atheist? I think fundamentally, yeah. I'm just going to choose to live for myself and do what I want to do. Even if I still call myself a Christian, and I still come to church, and I still do the religious thing, when I turn away from God, what I'm saying is I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm not going to submit my life to you. And so those really are the two fundamental dividing lines. You're either going to seek God with your life, submit to Him, and seek His favor, or you're going to take your life, you're going to embezzle it, and use it for yourself, and do what you would like to do with it. Now, with that in mind, and having Cain set the tone for this, it really transforms the way we look at the rest of Genesis 4 and the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5. Because of what I want you to see, beginning, I don't know if yours has a heading like this. Mine says, beginning at verse 17, this is the line of Cain. And so it gives you the genealogy of Cain. And as we've been saying, there's a reason why this genealogy is here. This is not just, hey, this person gave birth to this person, this is what happened in the history of the world. There is a point that is being made here. And the descendants of Cain, I want you to appreciate, are not descendants just by blood, they are descendants by behavior. And so these are the people who have chosen to live life the way Cain chose to live life. And notice that because certain people are emphasized, and it's not like all these people only had one child, right? These people are chosen because these are the people in the line of Cain who chose to live their lives like Cain. So look at what's said, verses 16 through 24. It says, Then Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now, pause there real quick. By the way, whenever you see someone going east of Eden, always a sign of wickedness, worldliness, and ungodliness. I'm not smart enough to pick up on that by myself, but a couple of books I read both made that point, or all made that point, so there's that. That'll come up later when we get to Genesis 13 and the story of Lot. But then he goes to the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain was intimate with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Then Cain became the builder of a city, and he named the city Enoch after his son. Irad was born to Enoch. Irad fathered Mehujael, Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. Lamech took two wives for himself, one named Ada and the other named Zillah. Ada bore Jabal, and he was the first of the nomadic herdsmen. His brother was named Jubal, and he was the first of all who played the lyre and the flute. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, pay attention to my words. For I killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is to be avenged 7 times over, then for Lamech it will be 77 times. And so what I want you to notice is that in this line of Cain, we see the world turning away from God in a radical and an extreme way. So let me ask you, how do you see the world turning away? How do you see worldliness in this passage? Yeah. Right? So maybe the most important thing, and we see that more when we get to Genesis 5 when we learn about the line of Seth, right? No mention of God, no mention of anything having to do with spiritual things. These are worldly, physical, carnal endeavors that all of them are engaged in. What else? I didn't hear that. Polygamy, right? And so that's a really big one. So Lamech becomes the first one that we know of to take 2 wives and fundamentally changed the way that God's design for marriage is supposed to be. Lamech is also interesting because not only does he pervert God's view of marriage, but he also becomes more violent and arrogant and rebellious than Cain. If you look at that little poem, then you'll see that while Cain succumbs to sin, Lamech does what? He rejoices in it. That's exactly right. Cain sought protection from God after his sin. What's Lamech doing? He's kind of looking for trouble. At least that's the way it sounds. Cain killed a man, and Lamech boasts about killing a child or a young man. And so Lamech he's become so much worse and more sinful than Cain ever was. What else? What do you see? How about verse 17? Anything there? What does Cain build? Why is that weird for Cain to build a city? He's supposed to be a wanderer, right? And so what it seems like when he builds a city is he's actually trying to fight against the consequence that God had given him. He said, you're going to be a wanderer. You're not going to have a home. You're going to be a nomad. And so Cain says, look what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a city. You don't move cities around, do you? And so it seems like he's rebelling against the consequence that God had given him. Not to mention that in the Bible, building cities and building civilizations and societies, we'll see this more in Genesis 11 when we get to Babel, but that is all signs of worldliness and wickedness and things like that. So what I want you to notice is that Cain's descendants are focused on worldly things and carnal things. They are known for building cities, training livestock, inventing instruments, forging weapons to kill, and tools to build, and instruments to play beautiful songs on. All of their accomplishments are worldly. All of them are materialistic. And as Carrie pointed out, maybe more important than anything that's said about them is the thing that's not said about them. You do not hear about Cain's descendants offering sacrifices. You don't hear that they're building altars. They don't seek God or talk about God or think about God. And that is strikingly different from what we read about the line of Seth. So look at what we read. This is the line of Seth beginning in verse 25 of Genesis 4. Adam was intimate with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has given me another offspring in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. A son was born to Seth also, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to do what? Call on the name of the Lord. I'm not going to ask you if you remember my sermon, but if you don't, then I must have not done a good job. Anyway, so much of what we read about later on in Genesis 5, it's kind of straight genealogy. This person did this person gave birth to this person. But there are a few important things to point out. The first one being right here in verse 26, that it was not during the line of Cain that it's mentioned that people began to call upon the name of the Lord, but it is after the birth of Enosh that people began to call upon the name of the Lord. That means they wanted to seek God, they wanted to find God. They decided that they're going to spend their lives trying to figure out what pleases God. And so this is when people call upon the name of the Lord. I also want you to notice, if you go to chapter 5, verses 21 through 24, that just as there was an Enoch in the line of Cain, there is an Enoch in the line of Seth, which is probably the Enoch that you know better, right? Verse 21, Enoch was 65 years old when he fathered Methuselah, and after he fathered Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and fathered other sons and daughters. So Enoch's life lasted 365 years. Enoch walked with God, then he was not there because God took him. And so in the line of Cain, Enoch is the son of Cain, and he is known for what? In the line of Cain, he has a what built after him? He has a city named after him. But in the line of Seth, the same guy, same name, different guy, he is known for walking with God. He's not known for cities. He's not known for building instruments or forging tools. But he is known for the fact that he walked with God so well that God took him. Not only is there another Enoch in the line of Seth, but there's another Lamech. Did y'all know that? So there's a Lamech in Cain's line, and these guys I think are meant to be parallels to each other, right? You have this evil Enoch over here, and this evil Lamech over here, but then you have this righteous Enoch and a righteous Lamech. So look at what it says in verses 26 through 29. Methuselah lived 782 years after he fathered Lamech, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So Methuselah's life lasted 969 years, then he died. Lamech was 182 years old when he fathered a son, and he named him Noah, saying, "This one will bring us relief from the agonizing labor of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." And so just as the first Lamech, before you go, parents, Genesis 6 through 9. That's our reading for next time. All right? And so just as the first Lamech is remembered for what he says, so the second Lamech is remembered for what he says as well. And he gives birth to Noah, and he says about Noah that this is the one who's going to bring us relief from the agonizing labor of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. And ultimately, he's right about that. He may not know exactly how he's right about that. I guess there's a way to read this where you might think that he's just being arrogant, but that doesn't really fit the tone of Genesis chapter 5. Really what this might be is a prophecy that he doesn't fully understand, because it is through the line of Noah that Jesus ultimately comes. It is through the line of Noah that mankind is preserved and ultimately saved from our sins, because Jesus does come into the world. And so you have a wicked Lamech compared to a righteous Lamech. So ultimately what I want you to see, what these chapters are trying to emphasize to us, is there are two ways to live your life. You can choose to turn away from Him and make your life all about worldly, physical things. And it is interesting that in the history of the world, if we took the religious stuff, the spiritual stuff out of it, who seems more successful? Cain's line does, right? Oh, he's the line who has, Tubal-Cain and all those people who built instruments and forged weapons of bronze, and they're the first ones who were the nomadic herdsmen, right? They built cities. And so oftentimes, and the Bible's pointing us to recognize that oftentimes it's the worldly wicked people who really do kind of get the fame here. But we can live that way. We can give ourselves to this world and accomplishments in this world. We can be worldly and materialistic and get nothing from God. Or we can choose to be like the line of Seth, where we seek God. And instead of building cities, we choose to build altars. And instead of forging weapons, we call upon the name of the Lord, and we spend our life in that pursuit. And we may not get what the line of Cain gets in the world, but we get eternity when we're done. All right. Sorry I lectured there at the end. Y'all remember, when we come back next time, we're going to do Genesis 6 through 9. That's your assigned reading for next class. We're going to talk about what happens when the line of Cain takes over the world. And, no spoilers for that. So, thanks for coming to class. I'll see you guys on Wednesday.